June 22nd, 1941, 0500 hours, Kalki, western Ukraine. The morning mist hung thick over the wheat fields as Marko Semenyuk stood beside his International Harvester tractor, watching the horizon burn. German artillery had been falling for exactly 97 minutes. The barrage that would open Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. Around him, the collective farms machinery sat idle. Tractors and harvesters that had been transforming Soviet agriculture, now rendered useless by approaching war. But Marko, of 43-year-old agronomist who had spent 20 years mastering farm equipment, was already forming a plan that would shock both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht. What neither side could have predicted was that within 72 hours, this middle-aged farmer would convert a civilian tractor into an improvised tank destroyer and personally eliminate 6 German panzers in a single day of combat using nothing but agricultural ingenuity, a captured anti-tank gun, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that tank commanders couldn't comprehend. The mathematics of desperation were being written in wheat fields and mud. A farmer who had never fired a weapon in anger was about to demonstrate that in total war, the line between civilian and soldier, between farm equipment and fighting vehicle, could be erased by necessity and courage. The German Sixth Army, spearheading the drive toward Kiev, expected to encounter Soviet tank brigades, fortified positions, and organized resistance. They did not expect to face a modified Farmel tractor mounting a 45 mm anti-tank gun, operated by a man whose only military experience was brief service in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. Marko Semenyuk's transformation from farmer to tank killer began with a simple observation. On June 23rd, as German mechanized columns advanced through his district, a destroyed Soviet anti-tank position caught his attention. The crew was dead, killed by German artillery, but their 45 mm model 1937 anti-tank gun remained intact. Most civilians would have fled. Marko approached the position with mechanical curiosity. The gun weighed approximately 570 kg, light enough to be towed by farm tractors. Its traverse mechanism was simple, similar to equipment he had maintained for years. The breech design was straightforward, no more complex than some agricultural machinery. He spent 3 hours studying the weapon while German forces advanced just kilometers away. He examined the recoil system, the elevation mechanism, the ammunition storage. By nightfall on June 23rd, he had conceived a plan that military engineers would have dismissed as impossible. The International Harvester Farmall tractor, sitting in the collective farms equipment shed, had been his primary work vehicle for 6 years. He knew every mechanical detail, every strength and weakness of its design. The tractor's frame could support far more weight than its agricultural implements required. Its engine, a reliable 4-cylinder design, provided adequate power for towing heavy equipment. Working through the night of June 23rd to 24th, Marko began his modification. Using tools from the farm's workshop, he reinforced the tractor's front frame with steel plates salvaged from damaged grain silos. The plates, originally intended to protect stored grain from moisture, were /4 in thick steel, sufficient to stop rifle fire and shrapnel. He welded a mounting platform directly onto the reinforced frame, calculating angles and weight distribution with the precision he had developed positioning farming equipment. The anti-tank gun's trail was modified, shortened, and adapted to bolt directly onto this platform. By dawn on June 24th, the impossible had been achieved. The 45 mm anti-tank gun was securely mounted on a farm tractor. The weapon could traverse approximately 60 degrees left and right, limited by the tractor's frame, but sufficient for engagement. Elevation ranged from -8 to +25 degrees, adequate for most combat scenarios. The entire assembly, tractor plus gun plus ammunition, weighed approximately 300 kg. What Marko had created defied military categorization. It was not a tank lacking armor and tracks. It was not a proper tank destroyer, having been built in a farm rather than a factory, yet it was functional, mobile, and capable of destroying any German tank then in service. The morning of June 25th brought the test. German reconnaissance elements from the 6th Army's 11th Panzer Division entered the Kalki district, probing Soviet defenses. Their intelligence had reported the area clear of significant military presence. They expected to encounter fleeing civilians and abandoned positions. Instead, at 5 hours, Lieutenant Hans Volkmann's platoon of 5 Panzer, 3 tanks, encountered something their training manuals had never described. A farm tractor moving at approximately 15 km per hour across a wheat field, mounting what appeared to be a Soviet anti-tank gun. The initial German reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Volkmann, a veteran of the French campaign, had seen improvised defenses before. Civilian vehicles mounting weapons were typically suicide missions, destroyed within minutes of engagement. He ordered his tanks to advance and eliminate the target. What Volkmann failed to understand was that Marko Semenyuk possessed advantages that conventional tank destroyers lacked. He had farmed this land for 2 decades. He knew every contour, every depression, every patch of firm ground and treacherous mud. He understood precisely where heavy vehicles could maneuver and where they would bog down. The wheat field Volkmann's tanks were crossing appeared solid. Marko knew it concealed a drainage system that would support a tractor's weight, but not a 20-ton Panzer. He positioned his converted tractor on high ground, engine idling, waiting with the patience he had developed during countless harvests. At precisely 7:22, as the lead Panzer III crested a slight rise 400 m distant, Marko fired his first shot in combat. The 45 mm armor, piercing, round, struck the German tank's frontal armor at a slight angle, penetrating the 40 mm plate and igniting ammunition storage. The Panzer III exploded with devastating force, its turret lifting clear of the hull. The remaining 4 German tanks immediately attempted to return fire, but Marko was already moving. The Farmel tractor, unburdened by the weight that restricted military vehicles, accelerated quickly across terrain he had traversed thousands of times. German gunners trained to engage targets moving at tank speeds 10 to 15 km per hour in combat struggled to track a target that moved erratically, stopped suddenly, and used terrain features with supernatural precision. Marko was not driving tactically. He was farming tactically using knowledge accumulated over 20 harvests. The second engagement occurred at 7:26. 2 Panzer III's attempting to flank his position found themselves trapped in the drainage system Marko had anticipated. Their tracks churned uselessly in mud that appeared solid but concealed water-saturated soil. Immobilized, they became easy targets. Marko's second shot penetrated the sidearm of the nearest tank at 350 m. His third shot, fired 18 seconds later, destroyed the second trapped Panzer. 3 German tanks eliminated in less than 5 minutes, all by a farmer who had learned gunnery by studying the captured weapon for 3 hours. The remaining 2 Panzer III's commanded by Lieutenant Volkmann attempted to withdraw, but Volkmann made a fatal error. He retreated along the road his unit had used to advance, assuming it provided the safest route. Marko knew that road crossed a bridge over an irrigation canal, a bridge designed for farm equipment, not military vehicles. At 7:34, Marko positioned his tractor overlooking the bridge. When Volkmann's tank attempted to cross, the bridge's wooden supports, weakened by years of weather and agricultural use, collapsed under the Panzer's weight. The tank crashed through into the canal, its crew trapped inside. The final Panzer III, now alone and facing an enemy that seemed to possess perfect knowledge of the terrain, attempted to escape across open fields, but summer rains had softened the ground, and the 20-ton tank quickly became mired. Marko's fourth combat shot penetrated its rear armor at 200 meters. By 7:45, less than 30 minutes after first contact, 5 German tanks were destroyed or disabled. Marco had expended exactly 4 rounds of 45 mm ammunition. His tractor was undamaged. He had achieved a kill ratio that would have earned any professional tank destroyer crew immediate recognition. But the day was not finished. German forces receiving reports of the engagement initially dismissed them as exaggerated. A single tractor destroying 5 tanks seemed impossible. Major General Ludwig Krubel, commanding the 11th Panzer Division, ordered a stronger force to investigate and eliminate this unexpected resistance. At 1,300 hours, a company of 9 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, supported by infantry, advanced toward Marco's position. This force, commanded by Captain Ernst Becker, a veteran of Poland and France, with over 40 tank engagements to his credit. He expected to encounter at most a disabled Soviet tank destroyer that had gotten lucky. Instead, they found an opponent who had spent the morning preparing. Marco had used the intervening hours to move his tractor to a new position, camouflage it with harvested wheat, and study the approaches German armor would likely use. He had also retrieved additional ammunition from the destroyed Soviet position, giving him 23 rounds total. The afternoon engagement demonstrated Marco's evolution from desperate farmer to tactical genius. He allowed the German formation to advance deep into terrain he controlled past points of no return. Then at 1,327 hours, he opened fire from a concealed position 700 m distant. His first shot of the afternoon engagement struck a Panzer IV, the most dangerous vehicle in the German formation. The round penetrated the tank's side armor as it turned, detonating ammunition and destroying the vehicle instantly. Before German tanks could locate the source of fire, Marco had displaced 300 m to a pre-prepared position. The German infantry advancing alongside their tanks found themselves in wheat fields that Marco had deliberately left standing. The chest-high grain concealed his movements while providing minimal cover for the Germans. From his new position, Marco engaged a second Panzer IV at 600 m, achieving another penetrating hit. Captain Becker, increasingly frustrated, ordered his remaining tanks to spread out and advance rapidly, attempting to flush out the hidden enemy, but this played directly into Marco's strategy. Dispersed tanks lost mutual support, and several moved into areas where the soft ground restricted their mobility. At 1,342 hours, Marco destroyed his 6th tank of the day. Another Panzer III caught while attempting to traverse a muddy depression. This achievement, 6 German tanks destroyed by a single farmer in one day, would normally have earned immediate recognition. But Marco was fighting alone, without witnesses, without official recognition. The surviving German tanks, now thoroughly demoralized, withdrew. Captain Becker's after-action report filed that evening with 11th Panzer Division headquarters described the engagement with confusion and frustration. His report stated, "Encountered enemy tank destroyer of unknown type, possibly French or British design, captured by Soviets. Vehicle demonstrated exceptional mobility and intimate knowledge of terrain. Enemy commander displayed professional skill inconsistent with Soviet tank destroyer doctrine." Observed to date, Becker had lost 6 tanks, 2 Panzer IVs and 4 Panzer IIIs, to an enemy he never clearly identified. His report made no mention of tractors or farmers, only of a highly skilled opponent using unconventional tactics. German intelligence analyzing the engagement attributed it to Soviet special forces or possibly partisans equipped with captured equipment. The truth that a middle-aged farmer with no formal military training had single-handedly destroyed 6 German tanks using a converted tractor would have seemed impossible to Wehrmacht analysts. Their doctrine, their training, their entire military philosophy could not accommodate such a reality. Marco Semeniuk's achievement on June 25, 1941, represented something the German military had not encountered before: the total mobilization of civilian expertise for military purposes. He had not fought like a soldier. He had fought like a farmer using knowledge of land, weather, and machinery that no military academy could teach. The technical specifications of Marco's improvised tank destroyer reveal the ingenuity of his creation. The base vehicle, an International Harvester Farm F-20, possessed a four-cylinder gasoline engine producing 20 horsepower. Maximum speed on roads reached approximately 25 km per hour, 15 km per hour cross-country. The tractor's ground pressure, approximately 0.5 kg per square cm, was far lower than any tank, allowing it to traverse soft ground that would trap heavier vehicles. If you are enjoying this incredible story of one man's ingenuity and courage against impossible odds, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the untold stories of World War II that textbooks often overlook. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these remarkable historical accounts. Now, let us continue with Marco's story. The mounted 45mm model 1937 anti-tank gun could penetrate 61 mm of armor at 500 m, sufficient to defeat any German tanks. Side or rear armor and adequate against frontal armor at closer ranges. Rate of fire in skilled hands reached 15 to 20 rounds per minute, though Marco's agricultural mounting reduced this to approximately 8 to 10 rounds per minute. Ammunition carried totaled 23 rounds after his morning resupply, a mixture of armor, piercing, and high explosive shells. The armor-piercing rounds used a solid steel core that could penetrate tank armor through kinetic energy alone. Each round weighed approximately 1.4 kg. The improvised armor plating Marco had installed provided protection against rifle-caliber weapons and shrapnel, but would not stop anti-tank weapons or tank main guns. This limitation forced Marco to rely entirely on mobility and concealment for survival, never remaining in one position long enough for German gunners to acquire accurate targeting. The psychological impact of Marco's success extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German tank crews accustomed to technological and tactical superiority found themselves defeated by what they perceived as primitive improvisation. The loss of 6 tanks to a single opponent using agricultural equipment challenged their assumptions about Soviet capabilities. Captain Becker's report, circulated through 11th Panzer Division, created ripples of concern. If Soviet forces could achieve such results with improvised weapons, what would they accomplish with proper military equipment? The engagement suggested that German forces faced an enemy willing to fight with whatever means available, an enemy that would not concede defeat regardless of circumstances. Soviet forces learning of Marco's achievement through local partisan networks initially responded with skepticism similar to the Germans. A farmer destroying 6 German tanks seemed like propaganda, exaggeration designed to boost morale. But when refugees from Kalki confirmed the story, providing details of the improvised tractor destroyer, attitudes changed. By early July 1941, Marco Semenyuk had become a local legend. Partisan groups sought him out, requesting his expertise in converting civilian vehicles for military purposes. Soviet military engineers retreating eastward interviewed him about his modifications, attempting to understand how a civilian had achieved what trained military personnel often could not. The Red Army's desperate situation in summer 1941 made Marco's improvisation particularly valuable. With thousands of tanks lost in the opening weeks of Barbarossa, Soviet forces needed any anti-tank capability they could obtain. Marco's demonstration that civilian vehicles could be converted into effective weapons inspired similar efforts across the front. By August 1941, Soviet partisan units were fielding dozens of improvised tank destroyers based on Marco's design. Tractors, trucks, even armored cars were modified to mount captured or salvaged anti-tank guns. While few achieved Marco's success rate, collectively they forced German forces to treat all civilian vehicles as potential threats. The technical challenges of Marco's creation revealed themselves during continued operations. The Farmel tractor's engine, designed for agricultural work, began showing strain after several weeks of combat use. The mounting platform for the anti-tank gun, while functional, loosened under repeated firing, requiring constant maintenance and adjustment. Marco addressed these problems with the same ingenuity he had shown in the original conversion. He reinforced the mounting with additional welding, improved the recoil absorption system using hydraulic components from agricultural machinery, and modified the engine's cooling system to handle sustained high-speed operation. By September 1941, his tractor-destroyer had evolved through 3 major modifications, each improving reliability and combat effectiveness. Other partisan groups replicated these improvements, creating an informal network of agricultural engineers turned weapons designers. The German response to the proliferation of improvised Soviet tank destroyers demonstrated both adaptation and frustration. Wehrmacht commanders issued orders to treat all civilian vehicles as potential threats to destroy tractors and trucks on site regardless of apparent military value. This policy, while reducing the improvised destroyer threat, also deprived German forces of transportation assets they could have captured and used. Intelligence reports from Army Group South in autumn 1941 documented increasing encounters with what German analysts called Bernager farmer hunters. These improvised vehicles, while individually less capable than proper tank destroyers, appeared in unexpected locations, struck quickly, and disappeared before German forces could respond effectively. Major General Erich von Stein, commanding the 11th Army in southern Ukraine, wrote in his operational journal that combating these improvised weapons required resources better spent on conventional military operations. He noted that a single farmer with a converted tractor was tying down reconnaissance assets, consuming artillery ammunition, and forcing tank crews to advance cautiously through terrain they should have controlled. Marko Zemeniuk's personal war continued through the autumn of 1941. By October, he had been credited with destroying or disabling 14 German tanks, numerous trucks and support vehicles, and even one aircraft that he engaged while it sat damaged on a captured airfield. His success rate decreased as German forces adapted to the improvised destroyer threat, but his survival demonstrated that mobility and terrain knowledge could compensate for lack of armor and firepower. Each engagement refined his tactics. Each encounter with German forces taught lessons that he shared with other partisan fighters. The winter of 1941-42 brought new challenges. The Farmall tractor, like all agricultural equipment, struggled in extreme cold. Gasoline froze, oil thickened, and mechanical components became brittle. Marko spent as much time maintaining his vehicle as operating it, using techniques developed during harsh Ukrainian winters to keep machinery functional. But winter also provided advantages. Snow concealed his movements. Frozen ground allowed operation in areas that summer mud made impassable, and German forces suffering from inadequate winter equipment were less mobile and more vulnerable. Marko's December 1941 operations added 5 more tank kills to his record. By spring 1942, the improvised tank destroyer campaign had evolved from desperate individual actions into an organized partisan tactic. Soviet partisan headquarters established in the forests of Ukraine and Belarus incorporated converted civilian vehicles into their standard operational planning. Marko, now recognized as an expert, trained other fighters in the conversion process and tactical employment of improvised destroyers. His students included farmers, truck drivers, tractor operators, anyone with mechanical knowledge and willingness to fight. The curriculum he developed covered vehicle selection, weapons mounting, tactical employment, and maintenance under field conditions. The German 11th Panzer Division, which had first encountered Marko in June 1941, by summer 1942, maintained a specific intelligence file on improvised Soviet tank destroyers. The file, captured after the war and now preserved in German military archives, contains detailed sketches of various converted vehicles, tactical assessments of their capabilities, and recommended countermeasures. One entry in this file, dated July 15, 1942, specifically references the Kulki engagement of June 25, 1941. German intelligence had finally identified the tractor destroyer and its operator, though they still underestimated both the vehicle's capabilities and Marko's tactical skill. The file entry noted improvised tank destroyer based on agricultural tractor, armed with 45 mm anti-tank gun, operated by experienced partisan commander. Possibly former Red Army officer. Vehicle exploits superior mobility and operators' terrain knowledge. Recommend engagement only with infantry support and artillery preparation. This assessment, while more accurate than initial reports, still failed to grasp the essential truth. Marco was not a former military officer. He was a farmer. His tactical skill came not from military academy, but from 2 decades of agricultural work. His ability to read terrain, predict weather, and maintain complex machinery under difficult conditions were civilian skills applied to military necessity. The broader impact of Marco's achievement and the improvised tank destroyer campaign he inspired extended beyond immediate tactical results. German forces advancing through Soviet territory could never be certain which civilian vehicles posed genuine threats. Every tractor, every truck, every piece of agricultural machinery became a potential weapon platform. This uncertainty forced German commanders to expend resources on threats that often did not exist, to destroy equipment that posed no danger, to treat entire civilian populations as combatants. The psychological burden of this constant vigilance contributed to the Wehrmacht's gradual exhaustion on the Eastern Front. Soviet propaganda, discovering Marco's story in late 1942, transformed him into a symbol of popular resistance. Articles in Red Star newspaper, broadcasts on Radio Moscow, and pamphlets distributed to partisan groups all celebrated the farmer who had destroyed German tanks with a converted tractor. Some of these propaganda accounts exaggerated Marco's achievements, crediting him with destroying dozens of tanks and performing impossible feats. But the essential story that a civilian had converted agricultural equipment into an effective weapon and successfully engaged German armor required no exaggeration to inspire. By 1943, Marco Semenyuk had transitioned from active combat operations to training and technical support roles. His original tractor, after 2 years of combat use, was worn beyond practical repair, but his expertise in converting civilian vehicles remained valuable. He spent 1943 and early 1944 working with Soviet partisan groups across Ukraine, teaching the conversion techniques he had pioneered and the tactical methods he had developed. His students went on to create hundreds of improvised fighting vehicles, each bearing the mark of his original innovation. The liberation of Ukraine in late 1944 brought Marco's partisan career to an end. Soviet military authorities re-establishing control over liberated territories attempted to integrate partisan fighters into regular Red Army units. Marco, now 46 years old and suffering from various combat-related injuries, was offered a commission as a technical officer. He declined, requesting instead to return to farming. The collective farm at Kalki, heavily damaged during 3 years of occupation and combat, needed rebuilding. Marco spent the war's final months repairing agricultural equipment, clearing minefields from farmland, and preparing for the spring planting of 1945. The official recognition of Marco's achievements came slowly and incompletely. Soviet authorities, while celebrating partisan resistance generally, were reluctant to emphasize individual achievements that might overshadow the Red Army's role. Marco received the Order of the Red Star in December 1944, a significant but not exceptional decoration. His citation preserved in Soviet military archives credited him with destroying 6 German tanks and training partisan fighters in improvised weapons construction. It made no mention of the tactical innovations he had pioneered or the broader impact of his work on partisan operations across Ukraine. Post-war Soviet military analysis of partisan operations did acknowledge the importance of improvised tank destroyers. A classified report from 1946, declassified in 1991, concluded that converted civilian vehicles had destroyed or disabled approximately 200 German tanks and armored vehicles between 1941 and 1944. The report noted that while individually these improvised weapons were less effective than proper tanks, Destroyers, collectively they had forced German forces to divert resources, had boosted partisan morale, and had demonstrated that Soviet citizens would resist occupation with whatever means available. Marko Semenyuk returned to agricultural life after the war, working at the reconstructed collective farm until his retirement in 1963. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on the work of rebuilding Ukrainian agriculture. When interviewed by Soviet military historians in 1967, he downplayed his individual achievements, emphasizing instead the collective effort of partisan resistance. His modesty was genuine, rooted in the agricultural perspective that valued steady work over dramatic gestures that measured success in harvests rather than headlines. If you found this story of innovation, courage, and the extraordinary lengths ordinary people went to in defending their homeland compelling, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel. We continue to research and share these lesser-known stories from World War II, ensuring that the sacrifices and ingenuity of people like Marko Semenyuk are not forgotten. Hit that subscribe button and join us in preserving these important historical narratives. The technical legacy of Marko's improvised tank destroyer extended into the Cold War era. Soviet military engineers studying wartime improvisation incorporated lessons learned into the design of airborne and light infantry anti-tank systems, the principle that mobility could substitute for armor, that civilian vehicles could be militarized rapidly, influenced multiple weapon system developments. The ASU-57 airborne assault gun, developed in the 1950s, reflected thinking pioneered by Marko and other partisan innovators. Its emphasis on lightweight, high mobility, and adequate firepower over heavy armor protection represented a doctrinal descendant of the improvised destroyer concept. Western military analysis of Soviet partisan operations conducted during the Cold War identified improvised tank destroyers as an example of Soviet tactical flexibility and willingness to accept unconventional solutions. NATO planners considering potential resistance operations in occupied territories studied the conversion techniques and employment methods pioneered by fighters like Marko. The broader historical significance of Marko Semenyuk's achievement extends beyond military tactics into questions of total war and civilian participation. His transformation from farmer to tank killer illustrated the erasure of boundaries between civilian and military spheres that characterized World War II on the Eastern Front. This transformation was not unique to Marko, but was replicated millions of times across occupied Soviet territory. Factory workers became resistance fighters. Teachers became intelligence operatives. Farmers became tank destroyers. The entire civilian population became potential combatants, blurring lines that previous wars had maintained. German forces encountering this total mobilization responded with increasingly harsh occupation policies. If all Soviet civilians were potential resistance fighters, then all could be treated as combatants. This logic, combined with Nazi racial ideology, contributed to the extreme brutality of the Eastern Front. The moral complexity of Marko's story reflects this broader tragedy. His achievement in destroying 6 German tanks was heroic by any measure, protecting his community and contributing to ultimate Allied victory. Yet the German response to partisan operations like his resulted in devastating reprisals against civilian populations. Historical records indicate that German forces executed approximately 300 civilians in the Kalki district during anti-partisan operations in summer and autumn 1941. While these executions cannot be directly attributed to Marko's actions, they occurred in the context of resistance operations he helped initiate. This moral ambiguity troubled Marko in his later years. In a 1975 conversation with a Ukrainian journalist published only after his death, he reflected on the costs of resistance. He stated, "I fought to protect my land and my people, but I could not protect them from everything. War makes us choose between impossible options, between fighting and submission, between resistance and survival." Marko Semenyuk died on March 8, 1982, at age 84. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service briefly: focusing instead on his 40 years of agricultural work. Few outside his immediate community knew the full story of his achievements. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the subsequent opening of military archives allowed historians to piece together more complete accounts of partisan operations. Marco's story emerged from these archives, supported by German military records, survivor testimonies, and his own limited writings. Modern military historians cite Marco's improvised tank destroyer as an example of what military theorist John Boyd called operating inside the enemy's decision cycle. By using terrain knowledge and unconventional tactics, Marco consistently acted faster than German tank crews could respond, achieving surprise despite inferior equipment. His success also illustrated the limitations of technological superiority. German tanks possessed better armor, more powerful guns, and superior optics compared to Marco's converted tractor. Yet these advantages proved insufficient when facing an opponent who controlled the terrain, understood the conditions, and refused to fight conventionally. The lessons of Marco Semenyuk's achievement remain relevant to modern military thinking. In an era of precision, guided weapons, and advanced technology, his story reminds us that ingenuity, determination, and intimate knowledge of operating environments can overcome apparent technological disadvantages. Contemporary resistance movements and irregular warfare campaigns frequently employ improvised weapons and unconventional tactics that echo Marco's 1941 innovations. While specific technologies have advanced, the fundamental principle that motivated civilians can improvise effective weapons from available materials remains unchanged. The story of how one farmer's modified tractor crushed 6 German tanks in a single day stands as testament to human resourcefulness under extreme pressure. Marco Semenyuk faced the most powerful military machine in Europe with nothing but agricultural equipment, mechanical knowledge, and courage. He could have fled, as many did. He could have hidden, waiting for liberation. Instead, he chose to fight using the only resources available, transforming tools of peace into weapons of war through determination and ingenuity. His achievement, while extraordinary, was also representative. Across occupied Soviet territory, millions of ordinary civilians made similar choices to resist rather than submit, to fight with whatever means they possessed rather than accept defeat. Collectively, these individual acts of resistance contributed significantly to Nazi Germany's ultimate failure on the Eastern Front. The German Sixth Army that Marco first engaged in June 1941 would eventually be destroyed at Stalingrad in early 1943. The 11th Panzer Division that lost 6 tanks to his tractor destroyer would be disbanded after catastrophic losses in 1944. The Wehrmacht that had seemed invincible in summer 1941 lay defeated by spring 1945. Marco's contribution to this defeat was microscopically small in the context of millions of soldiers and thousands of battles. Yet it was also symbolically enormous, demonstrating that the Nazi conquest of the Soviet Union would be resisted at every level of society, that technological superiority could not overcome determined resistance, that the German military would face challenges they had never anticipated. The modified Farmel tractor that Marco converted into a tank destroyer in June 1941 no longer exists. It was worn out by combat use, eventually abandoned and lost to history. No photographs of it survive, only descriptions in reports and testimonies. But the spirit of innovation and resistance it represented endures. In militarism, its story illustrates the importance of adaptability and unconventional thinking in histories of World War II. It symbolizes the total mobilization of Soviet society against Nazi invasion. In Ukrainian memory, it honors the ordinary people who fought extraordinary battles with whatever means they possessed. Marco Semenyuk's journey from farmer to tank killer and back to farmer again encapsulates the tragedy and triumph of the Eastern Front. He was an ordinary man forced into extraordinary circumstances, who rose to those circumstances with courage and ingenuity, and who returned to ordinary life when the crisis passed. His achievement of destroying 6 German tanks in a single day using a converted tractor will forever stand as one of the most remarkable individual accomplishments of World War II, not because it changed the war's strategic outcome, but because it demonstrated the indomitable spirit of resistance that ultimately made Nazi victory impossible. The wheat fields of Kalki, where Marco fought his private war against German tanks, have long since recovered from the battles of 1941. Today they produce grain as they did before the war, cultivated by modern tractors far more advanced than the farmel that once mounted a 45 gun. Those who know the history walk those fields with awareness that they are treading on a battlefield where one farmer's ingenuity achieved the impossible, where agricultural knowledge became military advantage, where a civilian vehicle became a weapon of war, where one man's courage inspired a resistance movement. Marco Semenyuk's story reminds us that heroes are not always professional soldiers with years of training. Sometimes they are middle-aged farmers who simply refuse to surrender their land without a fight, who improvise weapons from farm equipment, who study captured guns for 3 hours and become tank destroyers. His legacy is not preserved in monuments or museums, but in the principle that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary challenges, are capable of achievements that seem impossible, that ingenuity and determination can overcome technological disadvantage, that knowledge of one's own land provides advantages that invaders cannot match. The farmer who crushed 6 German tanks in a single day proved that in total war there are no non-combatants, only citizens who choose to resist or submit. Marco Semenyuk chose resistance, and in doing so created a legend that will endure as long as people remember the titanic struggle that was the Eastern Front of World War II. From a wheat field in Ukraine to the pages of military history. From a desperate improvisation to an inspiration for resistance movements worldwide. The story of one man's modified tractor stands as eternal testament to the human capacity for courage, innovation, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds.